Welcome to Horrible Secrets. You found yourself back in my corner of the internet, and for that, you have my thanks. Tonight, we're going to talk about something that chills me to my core. We're talking about hitchhikers, those mysterious figures on the side of the road, thumbs outstretched, hoping for a ride. But what happens when that simple act of kindness turns into a terrifying nightmare? What happens when the person you pick up is not who they seem? Tonight, we delve into the dark side of human nature with 4 terrifying hitchhiker horror stories. These are the tales that will keep you up at night, the ones that will make you think twice before ever stopping for a stranger on a lonely road. So turn off the lights, grab your blankets, and prepare to be terrified. Our first story takes us to the desolate highways of Route 66, where the ghosts of the past linger like shadows. It was a stormy night, rain lashing down, wind howling like a banshee. A lone truck driver, a man named Jack, was making his way through the storm. Suddenly, through the sheets of rain, he saw a figure by the side of the road, a young woman drenched to the bone, her thumb extended in a desperate plea for help. Jack, always willing to lend a hand, pulled over and rolled down his window. The woman, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with fear, leaned in. Thank you so much," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jack told her to hop in, figuring he could at least get her out of the storm. As they drove, the woman introduced herself as Sarah. She spoke very little, her voice barely a murmur, her gaze distant. Then Sarah began to tell her story. She spoke of a tragic accident, a hit and run, a life cut short. She described the car that hit her, a vintage Mustang, cherry red, with a dented passenger door. As they approached a particularly sharp bend in the road, Sarah's demeanor changed. "This is where it happened," she whispered, her voice raspy, filled with a sudden, terrifying rage. Jack felt a chill run down his spine, a sense of dread washing over him. He looked at Sarah and noticed the bloodstains on her clothes, the ethereal glow that seemed to emanate from her. Before Jack could react, Sarah reached out, her hand cold as ice clamping onto his wrist. "They left me to die," she hissed, her voice echoing with the fury of a storm. Jack slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt. Sarah vanished, leaving behind only a bone-chilling cold and the faint scent of rain and decay. From that day forward, Jack never picked up another hitchhiker, the memory of that stormy night and the vengeful ghost of Sarah forever haunting his dreams. Our next story takes us to the sun-baked highways of Texas, where the heat can play tricks on your mind and every stranger seems to be hiding a dark secret. A young woman named Melissa was driving across state lines, her faithful dog Max snoozing peacefully in the passenger seat. She was on her way to start a new life, leaving behind a past she'd rather forget. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Melissa realized she was running low on gas. Just as her anxiety started to rise, a gas station appeared like a beacon of hope in the distance. Pulling up to the pump, Melissa noticed a man standing by the side of the road, his thumb extended in the universal sign of a hitchhiker. He was tall and lanky, with greasy hair and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Something about him set Melissa on edge, but she couldn't quite place it. He approached her, his smile widening, and asked if she was headed west. Melissa, torn between her better judgment and a nagging sense of compassion, found herself agreeing to give him a ride. She told herself it was just a short distance, that she could handle it. After all, she had Max with her, his presence usually enough to deter any unwanted attention. The man introduced himself as Jake, and as they drove he kept up a steady stream of conversation. He talked about his travels, his dreams, his life on the road. But there was something rehearsed about his words, something calculated that made Melissa increasingly uneasy. She noticed Max, usually a friendly and laid-back companion, was now sitting upright, his ears perked up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He too sensed something was off. As they drove, Melissa noticed a news report on the radio, a story about a string of unsolved murders in the area. The victims were all young women traveling alone, their bodies found dumped along the highway. The description of the suspect sent chills down Melissa's spine, tall, lanky, with greasy hair and a scar above his left eyebrow. Melissa's blood ran cold. This man, this Jake, he fit the description perfectly. She snuck a glance at his reflection in the rearview mirror, his eyes, cold and calculating, met hers. He knew she recognized him. Panic surged through Melissa. She had to think fast, had to find a way to escape. But how? They were miles from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but miles of desolate highway. As if reading her thoughts, Jake reached into his jacket. his hand disappearing into the folds of his leather coat. Melissa's heart pounded in her chest. She knew in that moment she was in grave danger. Thinking quickly, Melissa slammed her foot on the brakes, sending the car skidding across the asphalt. The sudden stop caught Jake off guard, throwing him forward. Before he could regain his balance, Melissa unbuckled her seatbelt, threw open the car door and screamed for Max to follow. She tumbled out of the car, scrambling to her feet, adrenaline coursing through her veins. Our next story takes us to the winding mountain roads of Colorado, where the beauty of nature can be both alluring and deadly. Two friends, Mark and David, were on a road trip, their backpacks filled with camping gear and their hearts filled with the spirit of adventure. They planned to spend a week exploring the wilderness, hiking through dense forests and camping under the stars. As they drove deeper into the mountains, the sun began to set, casting long shadows that danced across the winding road. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. As dusk settled in, they noticed a figure standing by the side of the road, his arm outstretched, his thumb out in the classic hitchhiking pose. He was an older man, his face weathered and tanned, his clothes dusty and worn. Mark, being the more compassionate of the two, convinced David to stop. He argued that it was getting dark, the old man was probably lost or stranded, and it was the right thing to do. David, though hesitant, agreed. They pulled over, and the old man, his face breaking into a toothless grin, thanked them profusely for their kindness. He introduced himself as Henry, claiming he was a botanist, studying the local flora. He told them he was on his way to a remote campsite, deep in the woods, where he had been conducting research for several months. Mark and David, caught up in the spirit of adventure, found themselves drawn to Henry's stories of the wilderness. Henry, sensing their fascination, invited them to visit his campsite. He promised to show them the wonders of the forest, to share his knowledge of the local plants and their hidden properties. Mark, always up for an adventure, was immediately on board. David, however, felt a nagging sense of unease. Despite his reservations, David reluctantly agreed to join Mark and Henry. They followed Henry's directions, their car bumping along an increasingly narrow and treacherous dirt road, venturing deeper and deeper into the heart of the wilderness. As they drove, the forest grew denser, the trees closing in overhead, blocking out the last rays of sunlight. Finally, they reached a clearing, a small, dilapidated cabin nestled amongst the trees. It looked abandoned, its windows boarded up, its door hanging precariously from one rusty hinge. This, Henry announced with a flourish, was his humble abode. Mark, his excitement growing, jumped out of the car, eager to explore. David, however, couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over him. He watched as Henry, a sly smile playing on his lips, approached the cabin, motioning for Mark to follow. Suddenly, David noticed something strange. A tripwire, almost invisible against the forest floor, stretched across the path leading to the cabin door. "Mark, stop!" David shouted, his voice echoing through the silent woods. Our story takes us to the neon-lit streets of Las Vegas, where fortunes are won and lost in the blink of an eye. Emily found herself stranded on the outskirts of the city, her car sputtering its last breath. A sleek black car pulled up beside her. The driver, a woman with piercing blue eyes and fiery red hair, inquired if Emily needed help. "Thank you so much," Emily said, her voice hoarse from thirst. "My car just died. I think it's the radiator." The woman offered Emily a ride to the nearest mechanic. Grateful, Emily accepted, tossing her suitcase into the back seat. As they drove, the woman introduced herself as Scarlet. She was everything Emily was not: confident, glamorous, and carefree. As they approached the strip, Scarlet's demeanor shifted. Her smile now seemed strained, her eyes calculating. She steered the car off the main road onto a side street. "Just a little detour," Scarlet said, her voice losing warmth. Emily noticed the buildings were increasingly dilapidated. She felt a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. The car screeched to a halt in front of a dilapidated warehouse. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. Scarlet turned to her, her blue eyes cold and calculating. "This, darling," she said, "is where the fun begins." The doors were locked, trapping her inside the car. "You see, darling, I love to gamble, and tonight, you're the prize." So there you have it, 4 terrifying tales that prove the open road can be a dangerous place, especially when you're sharing it with strangers. The next time you see a lone figure by the side of the road, their thumb extended in a silent plea for help, remember these stories. Remember that not every hitchhiker is who they seem, and sometimes the kindness of strangers can come at a deadly price. If you enjoyed these terrifying tales, don't forget to subscribe to Horrible Secrets and leave a like on the video. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, not every hitchhiker is what they seem.